Hey, my name is Nick. I'm the lead pastor at City Light LA. I'm so thankful that you tuned in to view this content. I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that it grows your spiritual walk with the Lord. If you'd like to learn more about our church, you could check us out at citylightla.church. Hope that you enjoy the content.
Well, today is a really exciting day for me because the Knicks are in the NBA Finals. I know. Pastor Josh told me, don't you wear that hat up there, but I couldn't resist. Listen, we haven't met yet. My name is Alberto. I get the privilege to serve as one of the pastors here at City Light. I was born and raised in New York, so this is a very big moment for me. You guys have experienced multiple championships in the last 25 years. I have not experienced really any in basketball, so please spare me. No, but seriously, welcome. Glad you guys are here this morning. We are continuing in our series in the book of Ephesians, studying verse by verse, line by line through this book. And we have been journeying through this book for the last several months and picking apart, studying it, seeing how it applies to our daily lives, while at the same time understanding the historical context and meaning of what Paul intended and what the Holy Spirit intended through Paul to the churches there in Ephesus. And today we are concluding this sub-series almost, as we've been studying through spiritual warfare and the armor of God, as Paul has articulated it there at the latter part of chapter 6, and we are now closing that up today. Next week, Pastor Nick will come and preach the last message in our series to just send us out from this book, and we'll start a new series after that. But as you open up your Bibles this morning, I want to invite you to turn to Ephesians chapter 6. We'll begin there in verse number 18. Now, I heard some boos and I heard some yeahs when I mentioned the Knicks earlier, and I don't know if there are any more basketball fans in the room or if you've been following the playoffs, but like I said, the Knicks are in the NBA Finals for the first time since I was 6 years old. And so, pretty big deal for me as a lifelong Knicks fan. But now Pastor Josh can relax. I'll take the hat off. And the rest of you who hate the Knicks, that's fine. I'll take it off. But I only mention that to just mention the following. With the NBA Finals drawing near and the matchup set, there's been a lot of conversation with really any championship around what does it take to be a champion? What sets apart the champions from the losers? What sets them apart? And I think for a city like LA that's experienced many championships, man, nothing. Okay, I guess that doesn't excite you guys. That's fine. That's cool. No sports fans in the room. That's fine. But in a city that experienced multiple championships, I'm sure some of you, maybe a minority of you, would argue that there's a long list of characteristics or traits that you would say, this is a champion, this is not. And I think one trait that I think most of you would resonate with, that I've come to resonate with and respect, is what's been coined as Mamba mentality. Right? Okay. So this fierce, relentless, unafraid mentality expressed by the late and great Kobe Bryant was one many would say was what led him to 5 championships. That's a lot. We haven't won any. For many, though, this mentality has been the defining trait that has separated the champions from the losers in the world of sports. Whether you hate basketball or hate Kobe Bryant, you cannot argue that mentality has been a defining trait in the world of sports. And I only share that to say that spiritual warfare is a lot like that as well. Because there is a certain quality that defines those who remain victorious in this spiritual battle and those who do not. And I believe this is what Paul is trying to articulate here in our text this morning. And so if you're there with me in Ephesians chapter 6, I want you to read there with me beginning in verse 18 down to verse 20. The Bible says this, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare boldly as I ought to speak. The big idea for our study together through this portion of Scripture is this: the victory of spiritual warfare is visible in prayerful witness. The victory of spiritual warfare is visible in prayerful witness. Now, over the last few weeks, Pastor Nick has tried not just to emphasize the reality of spiritual forces and evils and not only the tools at our disposal to fight against them, he's tried in every message over the last few weeks emphasize this one clear point, that the triumph within spiritual war is resistance. The triumph, the victory within spiritual war is resistance. Or in Paul's language, to stand, therefore. Resistance. And if the victory within spiritual warfare is resistance, then these short verses show us what that looks like in real life. That true spiritual resistance is most visibly lived in prayerful witness. Let me give you a few examples. When we're facing temptation to quit on our vows, our commitments, and our family, or when our reputation is being disparaged, when we're faced with questions or even accusations that we don't know how to answer, or when we are suffering from unbelievable loss, or when we feel like the truest thing about us is that we're unwanted, unhelpful, and useless, it is those individuals who live through situations like what I just listed, who still tell of a God who is strong, just, and kind. In the middle of all of that, that we would communally and unanimously call victorious. Those are the victors. Those are the ones who win. Those are the ones who are truly winning this fight, because in spite of everything they're going through, they are still faithful. Where does that come from? How does that happen? That those who in the midst of that great spiritual conflict are still able to trust God, tell of how good He is and how worthy He is, faithfully? Where does that come from? Well, I define it for us as a prayerful witness. Because it is a witness, it is a telling forth of the good news of Jesus and of what He's done that is first forged, that has to be first forged within the confines and secrecy of broken and tearful whispers to the God of the universe, and breaks forth in bold proclamation that that same God is true, is just, is kind, is gentle, and is loving. Think about it. The people who, in spite of everything that they've gone through, all the suffering, all the darkness, all the attack, that we see with our eyes and we witness in their testimony, in their life, who still stand upright and say, God is still good, Jesus is still on the throne, and the Spirit of God is alive and well and working in the church. It is those people who still tell of that, who still speak in that way and still live that way, that we would say, now that is someone who is walking victoriously in this spiritual fight. That is a prayerful witness. Because although we might see the witness, what we don't see are the prayers that they have been whispering in silent tears. That doesn't just happen. That comes through prayer. And so it's a prayerful witness that distinguishes the champions from the losers in this fight. But how do we do this? How do we maintain a prayerful witness? Well, here's how I want to put it for us. I can maintain a prayerful witness if, number one, I attend to the Spirit's voice within my prayers. I can maintain a prayerful witness if I attend, I listen, I follow to the Spirit's voice within my prayers. See, Paul's allusions to military imagery continues in this portion of his writing in the sense that every military officer has a commanding officer they must take directives from. In the past, that communication was delivered through means of physical messengers, then letters, then radio, and of course now today, digital and online and satellite communications. But for us as the church, the line of communication those directives are received from, one of those lines of communication is through prayer. And the commanding officer who gives us those directives is the Spirit of God. Hence why Paul says here in the first part of verse 18, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. What Paul is calling for here is a kind of praying that must be prayed in every season, in every way, at all times, in every place. The kind of prayer that happens in private and happens with others. That is desperate and joyful. That is worshipful and expectant. That is full and given in tearful cries and is also full of exuberant laughter. The kind of prayer that is full of thanks to God and is pleading to God for an improbable miracle. But above all else, though, it must be a kind of praying that is open and attentive to the Spirit of God. So how do we do this? How do we attend to the Spirit's voice within our prayers? Well, luckily, Paul also writes about this in his letter to the Romans. And he writes this in Romans chapter 8, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. How? For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. See, church family, here's the reality of our prayer lives is that we won't always pray in such a way that aligns with God's intention and desires for us. However, although that may be often true, that doesn't mean that we cannot pray in such a way that does align with Him. So how do we do that? Well, it's really right here in the text. To pray in such a way that is open and attentive, humble to whatever and however the Spirit reveals His will to you. It is saying in your prayer closet, Lord, this is what I want. This is what I long for. But if in the end your will is something else, then help me receive it. If this is not the way things are going to go, Lord, as much as I want it, would you help me to receive it in love? That is what it means to attend to the Spirit's voice within our prayers, to pray in the Spirit. And I make that distinction because it can be quite confusing with so much competing theology to think that to pray in the Spirit means to call upon some abstract force or language that is foreign to us in our prayers. What Paul is calling for here, though, is a kind of prayer that is humble and attentive to the Spirit of God. A kind of prayer that says, God, just like Jesus did in the garden, not my will, but yours be done. So, I can maintain a prayerful witness if I attend to the Spirit's voice within my prayers. Secondly, I can maintain a prayerful witness if I resiliently intercede for my spiritual family. I resiliently intercede for my spiritual family. See, it is very human to hear these messages on spiritual war and respond skeptically and pragmatically. And maybe you could identify with that. You've been listening to these messages. Pastor Nick has been preaching on the armor of God, and maybe you're thinking to yourself, man, this spiritual warfare stuff, man, that's just a bunch of crazy, abstract mysticism. But as Christians, as people of God, and as students of the Bible, we have to be more discerning than that. See, because spiritual warfare in our context may not look like demon possession or some Blumhouse movie, as much as it does perpetual distraction. It may not look like demon possession, but it may look like perpetual distraction. See, because for the Ephesians, I imagine, they were also faced something similar. This was a culture that was constantly inundated by Stoic philosophy and Greek mysticism. And it would have been easy for them to dismiss spiritual warfare as more mysticism and grow more concerned with the tangibles of life. But Paul doesn't dismiss the spiritual nature of our collective endeavors as Christians. Instead, he reinforces them. So he states here in verse 18, the latter part, he says, to that end, keep alert, with all perseverance, making supplication for the saints. Well, what end is he talking about here? To what end? Well, to the same end he's been talking about since verse 10, that there is a spiritual war being fought, and we are ground zero. To the end that we've been given an armor to fight against these spiritual forces, and we must use them or risk failure in the spiritual fight. And to the end that our fight is not fought alone, but also alongside other Christians. It is to that end, church family, that we must keep alert and make supplication. To that end, there is a spiritual war being fought. And probably the biggest trick in the devil's tool belt is to tell you there is no war. There is no war. There's no war outside these walls. Any Avatar fans in here? There's no war outside Ba Sing Se. There's no war. There's no war going on. There's no war out there. But that's not how Paul treats this. He treats it with a certain level of seriousness. See, because there in this passage, he says, keep alert. That word, keep alert, is a compound Greek word that means to stay watchful and awake all night. It is the verb tense of a particular job title that existed within ancient times, which was simply the job of a watchman. See, in ancient times, cities would fortify themselves with large, towering walls that would serve as almost barriers from the outside world. And the reason why they were built was to serve as protection from foreign invaders and assailants and enemies. And there was a particular important job of every single city, the watchman, the one who would sit on the highest precipice of that wall, keeping watch all night and day in case a foreign enemy would come to attack. And his or her job was to sound the alarm and tell the city, let's wake up, let's get ready, there's a fight coming. That's serious. But it's with that same kind of life or death seriousness that Paul calls for here. And listen, I know that the temptation for us can be to not treat it with that same level of seriousness. In our low stakes, normal lives, it may not seem that serious. But the enemy's strategy has always been to get you distracted long before you ever realize that you are being defeated. And what is one of the first things to go when we're distracted? Unity among the brethren. Think about it. Unity among the brethren is one of the first things to go when we're distracted, to see only ourselves and no one else. That we are the only important ones and that everyone or everything is about us. This is a first sign of defeat in this fight, church family. And if you ever find yourself losing the fight against those spiritual forces, if you're ever wondering if you're losing the fight, just look at how you view your church family. Do you view them with suspicion? Do you view them with criticism? Do you view them with resentment? Do you view them with judgment? Do you gossip about them? Do you avoid them? Do you judge them? How do you view your church family? Because what the scriptures would tell us is that if that is how you view and treat your church family, then the enemy already has a foothold in your life. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Because we'd like to think that we are far more capable, far more spiritual, and far better off than we think we are. But when we think and treat our spiritual brothers and sisters in a way that is not like family, then the scriptures would say, you're already losing the fight. However, Paul's path to victory is straightforward and quite simple. To resiliently pray for your spiritual family. Keep alert with all perseverance. With all perseverance, making supplication. Because it is far harder to drift into isolation, disconnection, gossip, and disunity when you're in fervent prayer for your church family. And I know that people can be tiring. Believe me, I know people can be tiring. I'm not going to name any names. I'm just kidding. But one of the enemy strategies in our culture is not merely defiance, but also depletion. And if he can get us tired, if he can get us depleted, then prayer will eventually fade. The scriptures will grow foreign, cynicism will invade, temptation will feel louder, numbness will feel more comforting. Probably worst of all, the church will be neglected. And this is why, church family, it's so vital that we don't let up. Don't let up. We can't let up because the nature of the spiritual conflict is that it comes for all of us. And it has to be fought by all of us. So even if we feel betrayed, attacked, annoyed, or tired of our spiritual family, we can't let up, church family. We need each other. So I'm pleading with you, if I'm not praying for you and you're not praying for me, we're only hurting ourselves in this fight. We have to keep praying for each other, even when we know each other, even when we tire each other, even when we are just fed up with each other. That's going to happen. It's normal because that's what families do. That's how families operate. But this is why we have to keep praying for repentance in our church family, pray for redemption, for reconciliation, for resilience. That would be our prayer, and that we wouldn't quit on that. So I can maintain a prayerful witness if I resiliently pray for my spiritual family. And thirdly, I can maintain a prayerful witness if I long for clear boldness in my witness. For clear boldness in my witness. See, Paul's belief in prayer as a marker of fighting this spiritual conflict effectively goes so deep that he did not think himself too big to ask for prayer for himself too. So notice what he asks for. Verse 19. And also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel. Paul knew what his purpose on earth was, to share the gospel with the world. But it wasn't enough for him to do that in just any way. He cared enough about what God was calling him to do that he wanted to make sure that it was clear as well as bold. Notice he first asked for words to be given. Also for me, that words may be given. Specific words, timely words, words that would fit the occasion and audience he's witnessing to, that the way those words land would resonate deeply and personally. And then, in addition to that, he says that in opening his mouth boldly, he asks that his witness would be bold and unashamed. And church family, here's the invitation for us. That should be our longing too. That should be our desire as well. That we long for that same kind of witness. The kind of witness that's clear and the kind of witness that's bold. That after all that resistance against the enemy, that after putting on all that armor as described in the previous verses, we would want to proclaim the good and beautiful news that changed our lives. Has it changed your life? This news that we aren't alone, that our sin and shame doesn't define us, that there is a God who is real and loves us more than we could ever imagine. Is that real for you? And so the call is that we would also be able to share that in a way that is clear, confident, and fearless. Now listen, I get that in our current church culture, a lot of us been conditioned to think that we cannot witness unless we know a certain amount of biblical or theological knowledge. Now, I understand that hindrance. I understand that setback. But can I encourage you with something? Is it helpful to know the Bible? Absolutely. Is it helpful to know theology? Definitely. Is it even helpful to know social trends and kind of the vices of our day and age? Yeah, for sure. But far more important than even any of that is for you and I to develop a desire, a longing, a holy longing to share this faith with others. Because here's the thing, if we know the Bible front to back, we understand systematic theology and all the nuances of different subcategories of theology and understand all the realms of neuroscience and social trends, what good would it do if we don't long to let other people know about Jesus? What good would it do? What good would it do if we don't share this with others? If we don't tell others about how Jesus transformed our lives? What good would it do? We're sitting on this pot of gold and not sharing the wealth with others. What good would it do? We need to stir within us a longing to share our faith. See, because if we have no desire to share the gospel, many of us have come to believe, then maybe the enemy is already winning. So the application for you and me for this is really quite simple. It's to do the same as Paul. To pray for that longing. To ask God to fill us with that desire. And if you feel in your heart no desire at all to share your faith with anyone, then again, I tell you, the enemy has probably already been defeating you, and you haven't even realized it yet. But my encouragement to us today is that may we develop a desire to witness. May we reclaim this desire where we've now been silenced and reclaim it in prayer. So I'll maintain a prayerful witness when I long for a clear boldness in my witness. And lastly this morning, I'll maintain a prayerful witness when, number 4, I view every circumstance as a gospel opportunity. See, studying this letter over the last few months together as a church, it can be easy to forget that Paul was dictating this from a prison cell. Maybe you haven't forgotten, but I certainly did. And see, Paul, you might notice from the picture behind me that Paul wasn't writing this letter or dictating this letter to Tychicus from a study with wonderful smelling incense and candlelight. He wasn't in some natural landscape surrounded by trees or next to a calm lake with a gentle breeze. He was in a prison cell, a dark, unsanitary, isolated prison cell awaiting trial, with no light except for a hole above him where his jailers would more commonly throw down their own bodily waste than they would food. Think about that. That was Paul's experience in writing this. And it was a setting that any person would find to be hopeless, depressing, and soul-sucking. You know, kind of the way you describe the DMV, but much, much worse. It is in this place that Paul reframes his own state as this in verse 20. For which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare boldly as I ought to speak. See, Paul could have easily viewed his situation as desperate, hopeless, or even pointless. But he saw something many of us often fail to see in our normal, low-stakes lives, that every circumstance offers ample opportunity for the gospel to shine brightly. Every circumstance. And look, I'll say it again because I think it bears repeating. Our lives are not full with even a fraction of as much risk here living in Western America as it did for Paul in first century Rome. And yet even he saw in his dire circumstance ample opportunity. And this does not mean that God does not care to hear our complaints or our sorrows or our circumstances or how hard things are. In fact, most of the Psalms are full of complaints offered to God in prayer. But rather than that, when we're engaged in the spiritual fight as prayerful witnesses, what Paul is arguing for here is that it shouldn't matter to our witness what situation or setting we find ourselves in, that we can view it all as opportunities to share the gospel. See, Paul is also not arguing for the power of positive thinking either. He wasn't delusional. He acknowledges that he's a prisoner, that he's in a jail cell, but he reframes his status as a prisoner as just an add-on to his truer identity. Ambassador. Before I'm a prisoner, I'm an ambassador. Before I'm a sufferer, I'm an ambassador. That was Paul's primary identity. He did not allow his prison sentence to define him more than his status as ambassador. And where our current culture, our current spiritual warfare has produced silent, embarrassed, hidden, fearful of being perceived as naive, ignorant, or exclusion, or social cost, where our current culture has produced Christians like that, Paul argues that we must stand in the war with a different identity, the identity of ambassador. Because where the enemy can't get you sinning, he will get you silent. Sure, you may not be cheating on your spouse or addicted to some substance, but you haven't shared your faith with someone who is in dire need of it either. And if that's true, then the enemy is already winning. But if we begin to view ourselves as ambassadors, and slowly every moment may seem like an opportunity. Whether we are hanging out with a coworker after a long day, watching a game with an old friend, at a family dinner for a holiday, in line to buy coffee or groceries or boba, at the gym next to a stranger, in the hospital room awaiting treatment, or our loved one receiving treatment, or at the field watching our kids play. Wherever it is, whenever it is, it all can serve as an opportunity. But it begins when you reframe yourself as an ambassador, that then your circumstances can be reframed as opportunity. We must view ourselves as ambassadors so that every circumstance can then be viewed as opportunity. Because if we don't, then the opportunities that will pass us by will be at the cost of someone else's soul. May that not be true of us. May we as a people view every circumstance and opportunity as an invitation to speak lovingly, boldly, and clearly of the gospel that's transformed our lives too. That is the call. Now, I'll maintain a prayerful witness when I view every circumstance as a gospel opportunity. Our big idea for this message has been the victory of spiritual warfare is visible in prayerful witness. So as we leave here today, I'd like to ask you to consider a few more calls to action. We call it here, Consider the Call. Each one of these calls is meant to address a particular area within the spiritual life. The first one, I want to address it to those in the room who maybe don't identify as Christian, are new to church, or find the themes and subjects of the Bible and God and Christianity foreign. I just want you to consider this simple call to action. Would you accept the Spirit's invitation into a new way of life? The Bible tells us that the way someone comes into loving relationship with the God of the universe, with the God of the Bible, is by receiving and accepting the invitation by the Spirit of God to become His child. And I imagine that for some in this room, you have felt, maybe just today, maybe over the last few weeks you've been attending, this gentle pull on your conscience, on your mind, and on your soul to come close, to come near, to lean in. Can I encourage you? That may be the Spirit of God calling you to Himself. And this moment may be the moment that God is calling you to say yes and accept His invitation. So will you receive His invitation into a new way of life? But secondly, for those in the room looking to grow in their spiritual walk, in their faith, and have a relationship with Jesus, call themselves saved, and just trying to grow, I would ask you to consider the following. Would you carve out time to pray intentionally and boldly? See, we live in a culture today where busy almost serves as a badge of honor. And in our pursuit to remain busy, one of the quickest things to fall on the wayside is intentional time in the quiet with God. Quiet. Reading our Bibles, praying, thinking about Him, listening to His voice. Those things end up taking a back seat to our busy schedules. And so what I want to encourage you, fellow Christian, is would you consider looking at your schedule and deciding now, you know what, I'm going to wake up a little earlier to pray more intentionally. I'm going to go to sleep a little later to pray more intentionally. You know what, I can cut my workout short to pray more. I can go for a walk to pray more. I can take the long way home to pray more. I can leave to work a little earlier to pray more. Whatever it is you have to do in order to carve out time in your busy lives to pray more intentionally and boldly, I want to ask you, I want to call you, would you carve it out? And then lastly, if you're here wanting to live in such a way that shines brightly for Jesus in our city, I want to ask you to consider the following. Would you steward every opportunity to tell of God's love in your life? Would you steward every opportunity? Whether you're at the gym, at the grocery store, at your kid's game, at work, or just around in your neighborhood. Would you view it all as an opportunity to tell of how God has transformed your life? One of the things that I try to think about to encourage me in this practice is to imagine that person that I sense God telling me to speak to as a lifelong brother or sister, as a seat here in this room, as a friend to me and my family. And I want to encourage you, church family. There's a lot at stake when we miss these opportunities. May we be found to be good stewards of every opportunity and tell of God's love everywhere we go, at every moment we're given, viewing ourselves as ambassadors in our city. And so, how will you identify? Will you identify as a champion or as a loser in this fight? God has made you a champion. He's already won the fight. He is resurrected from the grave, and he's well and alive on the throne. But how will you identify? How will you live? Will you live in that reality? Or will you live in the oppression of the enemy? Let's pray together. God, we thank you for the distinction that you give us